The cabin of Flight 362 was bustling with activity as passengers settled into their seats, preparing for the long flight ahead. Among them was Marissa Reynolds, a well-dressed, middle-aged woman known for her impeccable style and confident demeanor. Marissa sat comfortably in her first-class seat, her designer handbag perched on her lap as she surveyed the cabin with a critical eye. Next to her, her teenage daughter, Sophia, was engrossed in her tablet, oblivious to the world around her. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, a young black man named Elijah King entered the first-class section, scanning for his seat. He was dressed casually in a crisp white shirt and jeans, a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. Spotting his seat, he moved to stow his bag in the overhead compartment. In the process, he accidentally brushed against Marissa's arm, causing her to snap her head around in irritation. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice laced with disdain. "Watch where you're going." Elijah paused, offering a polite smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It was an accident." Marissa narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing him from head to toe. "Do you even belong in this section?" she asked, her tone condescending. Elijah's smile faded slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Yes, I do. This is my seat." Marissa huffed, turning back to her daughter without another word, but the tension in the air was palpable. Elijah took his seat across the aisle from them, his mood slightly dampened by the encounter. As the plane took off and settled into its flight path, Marissa's frustration only grew. She had been dealing with the stress of a nasty divorce and a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband, Michael. The last thing she wanted was to be seated near someone she deemed as unsuitable for first class. The flight attendants began their service, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Marissa, who was in a particularly bad mood, was quick to find fault with everything. She complained loudly about the temperature of her wine, the firmness of her seat, and even the way her food was presented. All the while, her daughter remained silent, clearly used to her mother's outbursts. Elijah, on the other hand, tried to focus on his work, typing away on his laptop. But Marissa's constant complaints and pointed remarks made it difficult to concentrate. At one point, she turned to him and sneered, "You people just don't know how to behave in these settings, do you?" Elijah looked up, taken aback by her comment. He opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it and returned to his work, choosing to rise above her pettiness. However, Marissa wasn't done. She leaned closer to him, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, you're some kind of tech guy? Think you're better than everyone else because you got lucky with some startup?" Elijah sighed, finally meeting her gaze. "I work hard for what I have, just like everyone else here," he said calmly. "There's no need to make assumptions about people you don't know." Marissa scoffed, but before she could respond, a fellow passenger, a woman in her early 30s named Lily Taylor, who had been observing the interaction, decided to intervene. Lily had been watching Marissa's behavior with growing concern, and she could no longer stay silent. "Ma'am," Lily said, her voice firm but polite, "I think it would be best if we all just enjoyed the flight without making anyone uncomfortable." Marissa turned her icy gaze to Lily. "Excuse me? I don't think this is any of your business." Lily didn't back down. "Actually, it is. We're all sharing this space, and your comments are making things unpleasant for everyone. Please, let's just have a peaceful flight." Marissa's face flushed with anger, but she held her tongue, turning back to her daughter with an indignant huff. Elijah gave Lily a grateful nod before returning to his laptop, trying to focus on his work once more. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. Marissa's mood soured further as she stewed in her own frustration. She was already on edge from the custody battle, and being challenged by a stranger only made things worse. She couldn't help but take out her anger on those around her, and Elijah had become her target. Lily, who was sitting a few rows behind Marissa, could feel the tension and decided to keep an eye on the situation. She could sense that Marissa's anger wasn't just about the flight. It was something deeper, something that had been festering for a long time. Meanwhile, Elijah did his best to ignore Marissa's passive-aggressive behavior, but it was difficult. Every time a flight attendant came by, she found something new to complain about, often making pointed remarks that were clearly directed at him. The other passengers in the first-class cabin exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one else spoke up. As the flight attendants cleared away the meal service, Marissa's frustration reached a boiling point. She leaned over the aisle, glaring at Elijah. "You know, people like you are the reason this country is going downhill," she spat. "Coming into spaces where you don't belong, thinking you're entitled to the same treatment as the rest of us." Elijah looked up, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not sure what your problem is, ma'am, but I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself. We're all just trying to get to our destination in peace." Marissa's eyes blazed with fury. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she snapped. "I've had enough of this. I'm going to speak to the flight attendants and have you moved to where you belong." Before Elijah could respond, one of the flight attendants approached, having overheard the commotion. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone professional but concerned. Marissa immediately launched into a tirade, demanding that Elijah be moved to another section of the plane. The flight attendant listened patiently, but it was clear from her expression that she wasn't going to indulge Marissa's demands. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said calmly, "this gentleman has every right to be here, just like everyone else. I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from causing any further disturbances." Marissa was taken aback, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to formulate a response. The flight attendant turned to Elijah, offering him a reassuring smile. "If you need anything, sir, please don't hesitate to ask." Elijah nodded, grateful for her support. As the flight attendant walked away, Marissa sat back in her seat, seething with anger and humiliation. She glanced around the cabin, realizing that many of the other passengers were watching her with disapproval. Feeling the weight of their stares, Marissa crossed her arms and sank lower into her seat, her mind racing. She couldn't understand why things were going so wrong. She was used to getting her way, and being challenged like this was a foreign experience. As the hours passed, the tension in the cabin slowly began to dissipate. The other passengers resumed their activities, and Elijah finally managed to immerse himself in his work. Lily kept an eye on Marissa, ready to step in if things escalated again, but for the most part, the situation seemed to have calmed down. However, Marissa's mind was far from calm. She replayed the events of the day over and over in her head, growing more agitated with each passing minute. She thought about her ex-husband, Michael, and how he had always undermined her authority. She thought about the custody battle and the fear of losing Sophia. And she thought about Elijah, who, in her eyes, was just another example of how the world was turning against her. As the plane began its descent, Marissa's anxiety reached its peak. She felt like she was on the verge of a breakdown, and she didn't know how to stop it. She glanced over at Sophia, who had fallen asleep with her tablet still in her hands. The sight of her daughter, so peaceful and unaware of the turmoil around her, made Marissa's heart ache. She knew that she was losing control, and the thought terrified her. But she also knew that she couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, and it had to change soon. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. Elijah stood up, reaching for his bag in the overhead compartment. Marissa watched him, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to lash out again, to vent her frustration and anger, but another part of her, a quieter part, recognized that she had gone too far. Before she could decide what to do, Lily approached her seat. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I think it would be best if you took a moment to reflect on what happened today. It's clear that you're going through something difficult, but taking it out on others isn't going to help." Marissa looked up at Lily, her eyes filling with tears. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions, the realization that she had let her pain and anger consume her. She nodded slowly, unable to find the words to respond. Lily offered her a small, understanding smile. "We all have our struggles," she said, "but we have to remember that we're not alone. There are people who care, who want to help if we let them." Marissa felt a lump in her throat as she watched Lily walk away. She knew that Lily was right, but the thought of facing her own issues was overwhelming. She had been so focused on the custody battle, on proving that she was a good mother, that she had lost sight of what really mattered. As the passengers began to disembark, Marissa remained in her seat, staring out the window. Elijah walked past her, offering a polite nod, but she couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. She felt ashamed, not just for how she had treated him, but for how she had allowed her own pain to dictate her actions. Sophia stirred next to her, waking up as the plane came to a stop. "Mom, are we here?" she asked sleepily. Marissa nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart, we're here." As they gathered their belongings and made their way off the plane, Marissa's mind was racing. She knew that she had to make a change, not just for herself, but for Sophia. She couldn't continue down this path of anger and resentment. She had to find a way to heal, to become the mother that Sophia deserved. As they exited the terminal and stepped out into the bustling airport, Marissa took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day slowly lifting. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it with a renewed sense of purpose. She would start by apologizing to Elijah. It wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was a step in the right direction. She knew that it would take time to make amends, to rebuild the trust she had lost, but she was willing to try. As they walked through the airport, Marissa spotted Elijah in the distance, waiting for his luggage. She hesitated for a moment, but then, gathering her courage, she approached him. "Elijah," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." Elijah looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Marissa feared that he would reject her apology, that he would simply walk away. But then, to her relief, he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. "I appreciate it." Marissa felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she turned to leave, Elijah called after her. "Marissa," he said, his tone gentle, "we all have our battles. Just remember, it's never too late to choose a different path." Marissa nodded, her eyes filling with tears once more. "I'll remember that," she said softly. As she walked away, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. And as they left the airport and headed home, Marissa knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter filled with healing, growth, and the possibility of a brighter future. As Marissa and Sophia made their way through the busy airport terminal, Marissa's mind was still reeling from the events that had unfolded on the plane. The confrontation, her own harsh words, and Elijah's calm demeanor, all of it lingered in her thoughts. She was still grappling with the emotions that had been stirred up, not just by the flight, but by the months of stress and anxiety that had been building in her life. Sophia looked up at her mother, sensing the tension. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked softly, her big brown eyes full of concern. Marissa forced a smile and nodded. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just thinking about a lot of things." They reached the baggage claim area, and as they waited for their luggage to appear, Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that she had reached a turning point in her life. The weight of the divorce, the custody battle, and the confrontation with Elijah had all come crashing down on her at once, forcing her to confront the person she had become. As they stood by the conveyor belt, Marissa noticed a group of people gathered around a television screen, watching the news. Normally, she would have ignored it, but something about the scene caught her attention. She moved closer, her curiosity piqued. The screen displayed a news segment about a recent surge in awareness and activism surrounding social justice issues. The reporter was discussing how everyday encounters, captured on video and shared on social media, were sparking important conversations about race, equality, and the need for change. Marissa watched in silence, the words sinking in. She thought about the video Lily had taken on the plane, wondering if it, too, would become part of this larger narrative. The thought filled her with both dread and a strange sense of inevitability. She had been so caught up in her own struggles that she hadn't realized how her actions might impact others, or how they might be perceived by the world. As she turned away from the screen, Marissa's gaze fell on Elijah, who was standing a few feet away, watching his own luggage come down the conveyor belt. He looked calm, collected, as if the incident on the plane hadn't rattled him at all. Marissa felt a pang of guilt as she remembered how she had treated him, how she had let her anger and frustration spill over onto someone who had done nothing to deserve it. Taking a deep breath, Marissa made a decision. She couldn't leave the airport without trying to make things right. "Stay here for a moment, Sophia," she said, giving her daughter a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "I'll be right back." Sophia nodded, her eyes following her mother as she walked toward Elijah. Marissa approached him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached him, Elijah turned to face her, his expression neutral. "Elijah," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I already apologized, but I need to say it again. I'm truly sorry for how I acted on the plane. It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair to you." Elijah studied her for a moment before speaking. "I appreciate that, Marissa," he said quietly. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong." Marissa felt a wave of emotion wash over her. "I've been going through a lot," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that's no excuse for how I treated you. I let my anger get the best of me, and I'm ashamed of it." Elijah nodded, his expression softening. "We all have our battles," he said, echoing his earlier words. "What matters is how we choose to handle them." Marissa felt a lump forming in her throat. She wanted to say more, to explain everything that had led up to that moment, but she knew that it wasn't the time or place. Instead, she simply nodded, grateful for Elijah's understanding. As she turned to leave, Elijah called out to her once more. "Marissa," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "don't be too hard on yourself. We all make mistakes. What's important is that we learn from them." Marissa paused, letting his words sink in. Then, she gave him a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you, Elijah," she said softly. "I'll remember that." With that, she walked back to Sophia, who was still waiting patiently by the conveyor belt. Their luggage had just arrived, and Marissa busied herself with retrieving their bags, her mind still whirling with everything that had happened. As they made their way out of the airport and into a waiting taxi, Marissa felt a sense of relief wash over her. The encounter with Elijah had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. She knew that she couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose how to move forward. The drive home was quiet, with Sophia dozing off in the back seat while Marissa stared out the window, lost in thought. She replayed the events of the day over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of her emotions. By the time they arrived at their apartment, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the city. Marissa paid the driver and helped Sophia out of the car, their bags in tow. As they entered the apartment, Marissa was struck by how different everything felt. The space, once filled with tension and anxiety, now felt strangely empty, as if the storm that had been brewing for months had finally passed. Marissa set their bags down and turned to Sophia, who was rubbing her eyes sleepily. "Why don't you go get ready for bed, sweetheart?" she suggested gently. Sophia nodded, too tired to argue, and made her way to her bedroom. Marissa watched her go, feeling a pang of guilt as she realized how much her own turmoil had affected her daughter. She knew that she needed to make some changes, not just for herself, but for Sophia as well. After Sophia was settled in bed, Marissa retreated to the living room, sinking into the couch with a sigh. She stared at the blank television screen, her mind racing with thoughts of what she needed to do next. She knew that she couldn't continue living the way she had been, consumed by anger and resentment. She needed to find a way to heal, to let go of the past and focus on building a better future for herself and her daughter. But where to start? The thought was overwhelming, and for a moment, Marissa felt paralyzed by the enormity of the task ahead. Then she remembered Elijah's words, "What matters is how we choose to handle them." Marissa knew that she needed help, professional help, to deal with the pain and trauma she had been carrying for so long. She had resisted the idea of therapy for months, telling herself that she was strong enough to handle everything on her own. But now, she realized that she couldn't do it alone. Reaching for her phone, Marissa began searching for therapists in her area. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. As she scrolled through the listings, she felt a sense of hope that had been missing for a long time. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, Marissa felt like she was ready to face it. She was ready to do the work, to confront her demons, and find a way to move forward.